But another memento of childhood certainly was princely. A heavy gold bracelet that was found in a special jewellery box in the tomb. It's decorated with a finely moulded gold scarab inlaid with lapis lazuli. The wrist fastening is so small that it could only have been worn by a child, not a grown man. And since it was in the special jewellery box, it must surely have been Tutankhamun's personal possession. But who was Tutankhamun? We get a clue perhaps to his identity from this little painter's palette. Inscriptions show that it was made for the eldest surviving daughter of Nefertiti and the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. And this princess had been married to Akhenaten's co-regent Menkaure. And later she became Tutankhamun's sister-in-law when Tutankhamun came to the throne. But would she have presented the new pharaoh with such a child's toy? Was Tutankhamun perhaps her little brother, as well as her brother-in-law? Family relationships in ancient Egypt were extremely complex. Succession to the throne passed through the female line, and the one sure way that a son could ensure his succession was to marry his own sister. It's a little hard to remember that Tutankhamun was still a child when he was crowned king, but these superb pendant earrings were a sign of his youth, for only boys wore earrings in those days. These massive pendants, each about 5 inches long, are made of gold and inlaid with semi-precious stones, and in the center a duck's head of translucent blue glass. And the fastenings show signs of friction, indicating much wear. So Tutankhamun probably wore them until he was 12 or 14 years old. When Tutankhamun became king, he ceased to be a boy and became a symbol. He was little more than a political puppet in the upheavals that followed the controversial reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who was his father-in-law and perhaps also his father. And this modest but elegant cedar and ebony cabinet symbolizes the change. It would look not out of place in any Victorian drawing room, but it is in fact a political document. Inscriptions show that it was a piece of Tutankhamun's own furniture, but also that he had by now been converted back to the old religion of the sun god Amun that Akhenaten had tried to overthrow in favor of the sun disk, the Aten. The black symbols are the life signs, the Ankh. But the inscriptions also claim quite dishonestly that Tutankhamun was a mighty king who subdued foreign lands, capturing those to the south and trampling those to the north, slaughtering his enemies. Tutankhamun had grown up, for the record at least. He was literally stepping into a dead man's shoes. In this curiously shaped bow-fronted box, the knob on the front of the box bears the name of Tutankhamun. But there had originally been another name there and erased, that of Tutankhamun's predecessor, Menkaure, whom Akhenaten had appointed co-regent, but who seems to have died not long afterwards. Well, I don't suppose the palace carpenters had any particular political sensibilities. The king is dead. Long live the king. Hand me that sandpaper, will you? It was this incredible amount of furniture found lying higgledy-piggledy in the chambers of the tomb that gives us our clearest picture of the life led by the young King Tutankhamun. This fine wooden casket with its decorative ivory plaques shows a king and his queen shooting in their pleasure garden, both at ducks and at fish. A scene of domestic bliss fit for any king. Tutankhamun sits on a cushioned chair firing off arrows. And notice how the artist didn't feel that he could allow the arrow or the bowstring to obscure the royal face, with rather peculiar results. Meanwhile, the queen sits at his feet, a lotus flower in one hand and an arrow in the other, which she's about to hand to her lord and master. Tutankhamun seems to have been very keen on the blood sports. The ostrich feathers of this ceremonial fan have long since decayed, but according to the inscriptions, they had been obtained by His Majesty when hunting in the desert east of Heliopolis. And both faces of the palm are embossed with lively scenes of the king on an ostrich hunt. On one side, he's in his chariot, assaulting two stricken ostriches on the right. And at the same time, he's being shaded by a small Ankh figure in the left-hand corner, holding just this sort of fan. On the other side, he's returning home in triumph, while two servants of superhuman strength carry home the dead ostriches, each of which weighed 345 pounds. Among the 143 personal possessions that had been tucked into the bandaging of the mummified body were two daggers, one of iron and one of beaten gold. The gold dagger was probably for ceremonial uses, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, and the sheath in particular is elaborately decorated with cameos of wild animals biting their prey. When he wasn't engaged in blood sports, the young king clearly enjoyed gaming. There were no fewer than 4 gaming boards found in his tomb. The top board on this table was for a game called Senet, which seems to have been something like Halma. There are 30 squares, some inscribed with hazards and bonuses. It was a game of chance. The moves were determined by throwing knuckle bones or else casting sticks. Now, one figure has remained rather shadowy all this while, Tutankhamun's queen. Her name was Ankhesenamun, and she was a daughter of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and the beautiful Queen Nefertiti. Now, it looks as if she may have married her father when her mother disappeared from court circles. And then, after her father died, she married Tutankhamun, who may have been her brother, in order to regularize the succession. And in this magnificent golden shrine, we see her in a number of scenes with her husband. When Tutankhamun went hunting birds with a boomerang, she was always there, just behind him. Or else she was at his feet, handing him an arrow while urging him to spare a nearby nest of fledglings. At home, she rests her elbow most informally on his knee while he pours her a drink into her hand. Or else she's tying his floral collar for him before going to a party. Everywhere she's the dutiful and submissive wife, but she seems to have been quite a character in her own right. She had had 2 children by Tutankhamun, but they were both stillborn, and their tiny mummified bodies were buried in Tutankhamun's tomb. And after Tutankhamun died, she was in no mood to retire into widowhood and obscurity. It seems that she wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites saying, "Send me one of your princes to marry, and I shall make him king of Egypt." But her plot was foiled. The mail-order bridegroom never reached his destination, no doubt ambushed on the way. They played for very high stakes in those days. And these pastoral hunting scenes conceal the reality of power politics in the Egypt of the 18th dynasty, just as carefully as the artist once again concealed the bowstring behind the bland royal face of Tutankhamun, even though firing the bow in that position would have taken his head off. Now, despite this occupational hazard, Tutankhamun seems to have been inordinately fond of hunting if one goes by the fact that some 50 bows were found in his tomb. This one is one of the most elaborate. It's a composite bow, that's to say it's laminated with sinew and tree bark, which gave it a greatly increased range, and it's intricately decorated with animal and flower motifs inlaid with gold. There was also a number of boomerangs, most of them fully practical, although this one, made of ivory and capped with gold at one end, was probably made for ritual purposes.